Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I am Ray Offenheiser, the Faculty Director of the McKenna Center for Human Development and Global Business, which is the sponsor for today's event. It's my pleasure today to welcome and introduce our speaker, Mr. Bennett Freeman, who is an old friend and a fellow human rights advocate. Over the past 20 years, I've benefited from Bennett's strategic wisdom on a variety of public issue campaigns on a range of different issues, from U.S. global trade policy, climate justice for the world's poor, access to medicines for HIV-infected populations, indigenous rights for communities challenged by extractive industries, better working conditions for U.S. farm workers, and a variety of other ones. I'm delighted he was able to join us today and share his perspectives on the challenges facing corporate leaders trying to navigate the ever more turbulent world we live in. As we can all appreciate, the world for corporations was quite challenging before January 20th, but has become far more turbulent since. Let me offer a bit more background on Mr. Freeman. Over the last 25 years of a 4-decade career, Bennett Freeman has worked at the intersection of governments, international institutions, multinational corporations, responsible investors, and NGOs to establish global standards for corporate responsibility and accountability. A long-standing and innovative leader in the business and human rights arena, he has played critical roles in founding and building multi-stakeholder initiatives and coalitions to protect human rights and labor rights around the world. He has held positions at the State Department, where he was chief speechwriter for Warren Christopher, led work on the Holocaust Restitution Initiative, and drafted the voluntary principles for human rights that actually is observed by most extractive industries of corporations around the world. He later worked at the Calvert Investments firm, one of the first and largest socially responsible investment companies in the United States. There, he led their work in developing new environmentally oriented funds and their social policy and advocacy work. Currently, he is an associate fellow of Chatham House in the Global Economy and Finance program, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2001, and a frequent university lecturer, international conference speaker, and media commentator. He's also the lead author of Shared Space Under Pressure: Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders, published by the Business and Human Rights Resource Center in London and the International Service for Human Rights. He regularly consults for major corporations, foundations, and NGOs on a range of human rights and sustainability challenges, and has been the founder of many of the most innovative corporate standard setting and benchmarking initiatives that have become the reference point for most global corporations. But perhaps most importantly, he's been a pioneer in driving highly significant policy and structural change in corporate behavior across multiple industries. He is unique in that he's worked creatively and pragmatically with, for, and against corporate interests in advancing human rights within government, within industry, and within civil society organizations. He is a model for what good advocacy toward the private sector can be and also can accomplish. Bennett, welcome to ND. The floor is yours.
Good, thanks. Gonna have to spend the next 25 years or so living up to anything, but thank you. I appreciate that tremendously. I've got a couple props that I'll deploy later, but I'm happy to be at Notre Dame. I'm here for the first time since I spent half an hour on campus in I'll just say it, in October of 1981. I just finished my university degree and was driving across the country from San Francisco to New York to look for work and begin my career. And I was on I-80 and I saw the signs for South Bend and Notre Dame. And so I came to take a look at Touchdown Jesus. And I'm back now for the first time since then, but very happy to be here. I'm really happy to be introduced by my friend Ray Offenheiser, who I was privileged to be on the board of Oxfam America when he was CEO in some really important years. And I have to say that Ray is one of the best strategic thinkers and one of the most effective advocates I've ever worked with in my career. And I just really appreciate having learned so much and been inspired so much by Ray Offenheiser over so many years now. But I'm really happy to be at Notre Dame, and I've already met faculty, and I hope I'll meet some students later today and tomorrow through Wednesday when I'm here on campus. I've long admired Notre Dame. I first became aware of the university when I was a kid growing up in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s, and was very familiar from a distance with the extraordinary advocacy and leadership by example on the part of Father Hesburgh in the civil rights movement in this country, and also on behalf of human rights around the world. And I've also been inspired somewhat in my own work over the years by Catholic social teaching. I've become familiar with its basic precepts and principles, particularly around rights and responsibilities for human rights and workers' rights, the dignity of work, and the importance of social solidarity. And I've also followed from a middle distance, and I probably need to get up more closely to the tremendous work that the Vatican has done in recent years with a series of encyclicals that have provided incisive critiques of some of the excesses of globalization and capitalism, and really focusing on ways to reduce inequality and poverty around the world, consistent with Catholic teaching going back 2 millennia. So I find all of that body of work really, truly inspiring to help instill an ethical, a moral basis for what business does now in the 21st century. So what I'm gonna do is present an overall argument here at the top and then walk through, and I'm gonna take off my watch so I can stick to some time so that we can have sufficient time for discussion and questions, but I'm gonna state a basic argument at the top that will then outline the rest of my remarks that I'll be relaxed enough, I hope, to deliver more or less extemporaneously, given that I'm involved in these issues every day. So let me just start with a dual premise that might be debatable to some, but a dual premise that's preoccupied me from early in my career. And that is that multinational corporations exert massive power, for better or for worse. I would say better and more for worse over the years. But that there's an important and urgent, but incomplete and unresolved agenda for corporate responsibility and accountability that has gained traction for nearly 3 decades now, since the mid-1990s. And it's an agenda that now faces perhaps its greatest tests. Yet, for all of the extraordinary power of multinational corporations with which I became acquainted up close in 8 years I spent early in my career in the corporate headquarters of GE, General Electric Company, in the mid-80s to the early 90s. For all of that power, I think that there's an apparent paradox of corporate power. Multinational corporations, in my experience, are neither omnipotent nor impotent. They're neither all powerful nor are they powerless. They're at once both leading and following, without sufficiently clear roles and responsibilities in what is now a fragmenting international community and a fracturing global economy. As geopolitical conflict and competition collides with globalization and patterns of trade and investment, multinational corporations now face national and global cross pressures of extraordinary, even unprecedented severity and intensity. I'm careful about unprecedented. I have 2 history degrees, and we have to be careful in our terms here, but I really do believe, for the reasons I'll make clear in the next 20 or 30 minutes, that the pressures that multinationals face are probably unprecedented in their severity and their intensity. Multinational corporations face fundamental challenges now, policy and strategy, and in turn, they pose absolutely monumental challenges to national level and to global governance. amidst increasingly conflicting nationalisms coming from different governments and countries around the world. These challenges, I'm sorry to say, have, in my view, been compounded by the statements and policies emanating from Washington over the last 11 weeks since January 20, as the US has become the most disruptive factor in the international community and the global economy, with its combination of nationalism and protectionism driven by unilateral impulses and actions that have shocked the world. It's not easy for me as a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, appointed by a Democratic president, but who worked proudly toward a bipartisan foreign policy, who worked with Republicans when I was in the US government and before and since in the corporate world, very happily and productively. It's difficult for me as a former official, but as an American citizen, to posit that US government, in my opinion, has become such a disruptive force in the last 11 weeks. But for reasons that I'll discuss, I think that's the case, and that disruption has posed massive consequences and implications for the corporate world. So I'm going to now just sort of give you the structure of what I'm going to then do for 20 or 25 minutes and then stop and hope to have a discussion with you. I'm going to begin briefly by alluding to 2 millennia of history, the long history of interaction between trade and commerce with international relations and geopolitics before and since the emergence of multinational corporations. This is not a new set of factors. Trade and commerce have been intertwined for not decades, but centuries with geopolitical conflict, even if we didn't use those terms. I'm then going to turn, and this is really going to be the heart of my talk, to 3 phases, really pivot points that I've observed over the last 25 years that have each increased pressures and expectations on multinational corporations, and in turn have elicited significant actions by companies that have had dynamic impacts on local communities and economies and the international community and the global economy itself. The first I'll talk about is the mainstreaming of corporate responsibility and sustainability, including the human rights agenda, the climate agenda, beginning in the mid-1990s, the mainstreaming of what we call ESG investing and commitments to so-called stakeholder capitalism and corporate purpose. I'm then going to trace, and that phase is really mid-90s to the 20-teens. I'm then going to talk about several factors that have in turn, on top of the mainstreaming of corporate responsibility and sustainability, have really increased pressures and expectations on companies. I'll talk about briefly all of these factors: the economic populism that followed the financial crisis of 2008. I'll talk about the distinct but intertwined challenges posed by technological innovation and geopolitical competition with China. I'll talk about the disruption of global supply chains caused by those factors, as well as by the pandemic a few years ago, and also by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. And I'll then end by returning to the last 11 weeks, the epic disruption of American foreign policy and trade policy, with the apparent evisceration, I'm sorry to say, of the remnants of the international rules-based order. And I'll then conclude with an argument for what I call an important new framework of geopolitical corporate responsibility, and then conclude with a real urgent call for a new corporate responsibility for American companies in particular. So that's what I'm going to do over the next 20 or 25 minutes, and I hope that it will be a coherent argument. So I'm just going to go back to the history and just make a few points that actually intertwine in some ways with the history of Christendom and the Catholic Church itself, and that is that when we think and talk about uh, uh, business, multinational corporation, geopolitics, this is not a new subject. Trade, commerce, capital, labor, work, lives, and livelihoods have been all intertwined with conflict, with governance, uh, 2 millennia, even more if we go back to slavery in the ancient world. And then we think about the relationships in different countries, not just in Europe, but in other countries, other cultures, other regions of the world, so-called feudal structures of land owning, land rights, dispossessed peasants, not never possessed really, but workers. We think about moving men to the 17th and 18th centuries. We think about the transatlantic slave trade that populated in terrible ways parts of the current United States and Latin America. We think about the slavery itself in the American South. We think about the whole history of colonialism, imperialism, the role of commerce in driving and benefiting, profiting from some of that. I remember a few years ago finally making it to Liverpool to see the various shrines to the Beatles, but spending at least as much or more time in the Slavery Museum in Liverpool that made that city so wealthy in the 19th century. This history of commerce and trade and capital and labor has been intertwined with geopolitics and conflict for centuries. We move that into the 20th century, and Ray alluded to this experience of mine, but there became unmasked, uncloaked finally in the 1990s, the hitherto mostly hidden or forgotten history of the complicity of business in the Holocaust. IBM punch cards helping organize the concentration camps and the Holocaust itself. Swiss banks receiving bank accounts from Jews fleeing in terror, parking their life assets in the banks, and then being killed in the concentration camps, or maybe becoming refugees in the UK or the US or elsewhere, and then not being able to gain access to their accounts for decades, if ever, the rest of their lives. These issues came to the fore in the mid to late 1990s. I was in the middle of the restitution efforts that Ray alluded to that we really drove from the State Department in the latter part of the Clinton administration. So there's a long history. I mean, Dow Chemical and Agent Orange and the Vietnam War. I mean, so this is not new stuff. But what I would then turn, and we had the early CSR period, corporate social responsibility, 1970s, 1980s, the first SRIs, social responsible investors in the US, so-called ethical investors in the UK and Europe, but frankly marginal in my recollection, having interacted with some of them when I was at GE in the mid 80s to the early 90s. But then we had the first of these big inflection points, and that was the mainstreaming of corporate responsibility. We called it CSR, corporate social responsibility and sustainability, beginning in the mid 90s. And really, I felt witnessing it and then being involved in it in my last job at the State Department was that this was part of the whole debate over and backlash against globalization, the sense that inequalities, even as new wealth was being created and poverty was being eliminated or reduced in some countries, that inequalities were being created or at least exacerbated in various communities. There was the whole critique that had echoed roots in the 1960s and 70s of multinational corporations being exploitative. That took on a new narrative along with the big bad World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and a Battle of Seattle in 1997, I guess 1998. There was this whole backlash against globalization. And there was also alongside it the emergence of international NGOs, some of which, like Oxfam, have been around for decades, but newly empowered by the brand new World Wide Web global issues became local, local issues became global. So by 2000 or so, we had an emerging mainstreaming corporate responsibility agenda. We had the emergence of the business and human rights agenda, in particular that I got involved in '99 and 2000 state. We had the climate agenda. The UN Global Compact was launched in the year 2000. These were all related events. And what then happened over the next 2 decades, in my view and my experience in the 2000s and the 2010s, is that the corporate responsibility and sustainability agenda, and not least the business and human rights agenda that I've been centrally involved in, really moved from the margins to the mainstream. On the climate side, we had cap and trade here and there. We had carbon emission reductions. We had a new emphasis on renewables. We had, if not clean energy, some forms of clean investment. I remember at Calvert helping to develop the first global alternative energy fund as far back as 2008. On the human rights side, we had multi-stakeholder initiatives, a couple of which I was involved in establishing, but we have UN guiding principles on business and human rights that were established in 2013 after half a dozen years of consultation and development. So this whole, and then we had at the same time the mainstreaming of not just corporate responsibility and sustainability, but of these basic propositions in the investment community. So I got to Calvert Investments in 2006, which was then the largest and leading so-called SRI, social responsible investment firm in the US. And by the time I left 10 years ago, next month, in May of 2015, we had a full-on mainstreaming ESG agenda of investors, large institutional asset owners and managers, taking into account environmental, social, and governance factors in their investment decisions. And then finally, at the end of the decade, the 2000s, with all of this mainstreaming, and frankly, I think, given some impetus by the financial crisis of 2008 and the growth of economic populism, and also a more left-wing critique, progressive critique that emerged during the first Trump administration, we then had a belated recognition in the corporate world of stakeholder capitalism, and specifically so-called corporate purpose. Business Roundtable came out with a statement on that in 2019. I thought it was both a step forward, finally, but I also thought it was about 20 years late, that it could have been written literally 20 years earlier, but better late than never. So we had this big mainstreaming. The point of all this is that standards were set, pressures and expectations on multinational corporations in different industries were elevated. So then the next part of my argument here, though, is where it gets more complicated. And that is that, yes, we had a mainstreaming of corporate responsibility and sustainability, particularly on the climate side and the business and human rights side. But we also had the emergence of various pressures where geopolitical tension and conflict converged with, or at least overlapped with, corporate responsibility and sustainability expectations. So that happened in several ways that I alluded to a few minutes ago. And this intensification of the geopolitical pressures became really apparent in the first Trump term, and had something to do with a more isolationist, protectionist tone coming from Washington, yet nothing like what we've seen in the last 11 weeks. The first area, they're really almost hard to unpack because they're so intertwined, but the advance of technological innovation, the emergence of AI, although ChatGPT didn't take off until a couple of years ago, but we had the advent, the expectation of AI, and how transformational it would be beginning 8 or 10 years ago. But side by side with that, we had also greater competition, strategic competition, and potential conflict with China, a more assertive China with Xi Jinping beginning about 10 years ago. And the competition with China was, it was partly about, preventing a war in the South China Sea, let alone a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but it was also primarily thought out in terms of trade policy and with the beginnings of industrial policy that we then saw in the Biden administration with this massive investment in the CHIPS Act and the whole focus on developing, strengthening, expanding significantly American capacity in semiconductor production. I just saw that 6 weeks ago. I spent a day at TMSC, Taiwan Manufacturing Semiconductor, getting the acronym wrong. It's TMSC. I can't spell, lay it out exactly, but it's a massive facility outside of Phoenix. So we have these pressures mounting on the tech companies, and all against the background, not to overcomplicate it, with disinformation and the allegations of Russian manipulation, disinformation in our 2016 presidential election result, and so forth. So the China and tech piece became intertwined in mid to late 2010s and have become ever more intertwined since then. We see that being fought out now on TikTok, which remains in play. Then you have on top of that, the China and tech pieces. You then had the beginnings of supply chain realignment, talk of so-called friendshoring or reshoring. And again, beginning to be apparent in the first Trump administration, but then deeply accelerated by the massive disruption of the pandemic, where whole global supply chains were almost suspended animation. And from a national security, economic security, and public health perspective with pharmaceutical medicines, we started this whole process that is still underway of realigning supply chains. And that overlapped with really intertwined tech piece, the tech and China piece. So we've had churning, and some on the supply chain involved human rights issues, particularly the forced labor of the Uyghur Muslim minority in Western China. I've been quite involved in that issue as one of the steering committee members of the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor. And Congress enacted almost unanimously, which was not easy in recent years. And President Biden signed the law in December of 2021, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that basically drove the apparel industry initially out of Xinjiang. So all of this churning on the supply chain side, and then to make matters even more complicated, on top of the China tech piece, on top of the COVID disruptions, with adding further impetus to supply chain realignment, on top of all that, we then had the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 24th, 2022. And that led to an extraordinary event. In days and weeks and several months, we saw a greater exodus of Western companies from Russia than we saw in 10 or a dozen years from apartheid South Africa in the late 70s to the mid 1980s. And some of the numbers were exaggerated or somewhat inflated. There's been back and forth debates. Are the Yale numbers correct? Or the Kyiv School of Economics correct? I've been involved in this, one of the co-founders and leaders of Business for Ukraine. The point is that this was a huge challenge to companies to remain in Russia or not, and if not to remain, how to exit responsibly in ways that were took into account possible harms to employees, to contractual disruptions. A huge debate over so-called responsible exit from Russia. Unilever's case in point, it took them a long time, much longer than a lot of us would have liked, to make their decision that they announced last spring to finally exit Russia. They did so after a comprehensive and I think pretty conscientious internal process of evaluating the risks and options. The point is that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was an out-and-out attack on the international rules-based order. And as partly as a result of that, maybe we could just say partly because of reputational risks, that hundreds of American and other Western companies, some Japanese companies, exited Russia. So another example of geopolitical pressures and expectations on companies. And there's a whole ongoing agenda that I'm involved with and had lunch discussion about here a few hours ago about roles and responsibilities of business in conflict zones and both on the ground, but in local communities, but also these bigger picture geopolitical conflicts. So what I just walked through is how we've had this mainstreaming of corporate responsibility and sustainability, particularly on the climate and the human rights sides in the first 2 decades of this century. How beginning in the mid-2010s, we had a intensification of pressures on companies in the China and the tech context, both separately but also increasingly intertwined. The supply chain disruptions due partly to China and tech, but the pandemic and also human rights factors like forced labor. And then I just mentioned for a moment Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how companies reacted. And that brings me to the next factor that I also alluded to, and that's the last 11 weeks. And, you know, I'm going to be pretty blunt here, you know, my own assessment, and again, in sorrow as well as anger, somebody who spent much of his career when I was in government, but also before and since in the corporate world, working across sectors, trying to find various consensus, working happily and productively with Republicans in the corporate world when I was in government. But we now have a pretty grave situation, and the props that I've brought to dramatize are the last 2 covers of The Economist. I don't necessarily agree with everything I've read in The Economist. My late father gave me a subscription for my 21st birthday, so I've subscribed ever since. We won't try to guess how many years ago that might have been. But last week, the cover that came out a week ago, Friday, Ruination Day, the play on Liberation Day of these massive tariffs. And the cover that came out, that landed in my mailbox in Washington, D.C. this Saturday, The Age of Chaos. And so what we've seen is 2 converging disruptions that are now almost inseparable, hard to even pull apart. First was the whole disruption of U.S. foreign policy. Second, trade policy. On the foreign policy side, all of a sudden we're going to annex Canada as the 51st state. We're going to take Greenland, perhaps by force. We're going to retake the Panama Canal. We no longer are necessarily standing by our Article 5 commitments to defend NATO allies. We are seen to be, at best, undermining and at worst betraying a sort of sovereign, democratic Ukraine and favoring Putin's Russia. And with Europeans now talking openly, and our strongest allies, the Canada or Germany, their leader and transatlantic security without the US. I mean, this is shocking stuff. When I was chief speechwriter for Secretary of State Christopher, I wrote, among other things, with my team, twice a year, speeches at the NATO foreign ministers meetings. And to think that the United States government, administration of either party, would challenge, let alone seem to disavow, the most solemn commitments that we've had in our foreign policy for the last 80 years since the end of World War II was kind of unimaginable. So that's happened on the foreign policy side. And we all know, seen the news the last 12 days since 11 days, I guess it was 2 weeks ago tomorrow, or maybe Wednesday, I'm losing track of so-called Liberation Day, with these huge punitive tariffs on many of our closest trading partners, who at the same time, many of whom are our closest security allies. the Brits, the Europeans, South Korea, Japan, set aside China, 125%. We're down an all-out trade war with China that they project some confidence that they can withstand. We'll see how that works out for both sides. But the common theme thread here between the total disruption of both US foreign policy and trade policy is the loss of faith and trust in the United States of America, at least the US government. And it was one thing to repair some of that damaged trust from the first go around, 2017 to 2020. It's hard to see how that trust is going to be repaired. I'll just say it the rest of my lifetime. I hope I'll be around for some more years. The damage is just extraordinary. And it's not just the loss of trust, it's the total chaotic volatility and unpredictability. We've seen it in wild swings in the markets. Now even foreign governments are hesitating to buy US treasuries, which have been the basis for servicing our debt, but also their long-term investment strategies. I mean, this is kind of unheard of. The primacy of the dollar is the world's reserve currency of choice is now under question. So the question then is, why am I talking about basic foreign policy and trade policy? These are fundamental challenges, not just to our country. I didn't even talk about the challenges to our constitutional democracy and the attacks on law firms and universities, and the roundup of students who maybe have protested or posted something online. I didn't even just alluding to that. But why does this matter to multinational corporations around the world and to US multinational corporations in particular? And I think it matters because the world has depended, US, with stability and prosperity of the US economy and the global economy, have depended on a United States government that, yes, we have elections, we change parties, we change tack on policy here and there, but we don't have radical, shocking disruptions that make it possible for our allies on the security side or our trading partners on the economic side to anticipate what we're going to do today, tomorrow, or the next hour or two. And that's the situation that we're in. And so just think about the corporate response so far. And this is where I want to get into and conclude my remarks here, talking about what I call geopolitical corporate responsibility, but also I think the dire urgent need for American corporate responsibility. And that is that, again, I really believe in this proposition that the success of our companies, the prosperity of our communities, the livelihoods of our workers, the revival of some of our depressed communities, the regions here in the middle Midwest and elsewhere around the world, that we need to get to a place where we've got basic confidence in our policymakers, in whichever party. And I think that corporate America has been enthralled to the current occupant of the Oval Office. They've been in fear, and understandably. I published a piece in the Financial Times a few days before the election that was say it was too little too late, and that it was a futile, failed gesture is the understatement of my whole career. But a piece arguing that corporate America needed to speak out about the stakes in the election, the stakes of the Constitution, our constitutional democracy, our leadership, the international community. It didn't happen. And what I think is necessary now is for companies to do more than they've done. We've heard voices from billionaires. We've heard voices from Wall Street, plutocrats and tycoons. And we've actually heard finally statements from the Business Roundtable, which is sort of the top table of CEOs on policy issues, the National Association of Manufacturers, some of the other trade associations, we have heard concerns about the tariffs. And there's also been behind the scenes frantic lobbying for exceptions, and that's what led to this herky-jerky announcement that's been countermanded about 3 or 4 times Friday or early Saturday morning of exceptions for smartphones and some other tech products. We don't even know where we stand on that. But what I really think we need here is a new geopolitical corporate responsibility. And I proposed this in a talk I gave at Berkeley exactly 3 years ago in April 2022, being buoyed by the exodus of Western companies from Russia following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it seemed to me at the time that companies need to understand that they rely on a rules-based international order, that they rely on the fundamental rule of law, they rely on some degree of predictability, they rely on multilateral institutions, not just a unilateral nationalism. They rely on a more cooperative world to deal with huge challenges around conflict, around human rights, around climate, around the sustainable development. So I made that case, and I also think this has been a big focus of my own work in recent years, that companies actually should have a stake in civic space, in civic freedoms, freedom of expression, assembly, and accountable governance around the world. So I look back and I think, about putting that forward 3 years ago, and there was some logic to it, pivoting off the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now I look back on it and I think that, I wasn't crazy, but this was kind of a quaint plea for a corporate responsibility that really has no basis whatsoever now. That said, I think there's a need for it now more than ever. I think that multinational corporations, whether they're North American based or European based or Japan or Australia based or Indian based for that matter, or Chinese based for that matter, are going to rue the day that the international community and the standards that institutions that have defined it for 80 years has fallen apart. I think they'll rue the day when we've lost a normative-based international community, and with norms observed as often in the breach as in practice, but at least we've had established norms. Now we're in a transactional, and some would say mafia-style shakedown international community and global economy, with shakedown, again, all to say, coming from Washington, D.C., just sickens me, and as an American citizen and former U.S. diplomat, to say that in public or private, but that's where I think we are. And then let me end with what I think is most urgent now. It's fine and well and important and urgent as I think it is for multinational corporations to stand up for a return to some normative-based international community, which, by the way, is going to have to be reformed. And we're not going to go back into a world where the permanent 5 in the UN Security Council, for God's sake, is the UK, France, the United States, Russia, China. What about India, Brazil, or Nigeria, some of the other countries around the world? It's going to have to be a reformed rules-based international order. God knows how we're going to get there. But what I think is most urgent now is for American companies to recognize the attack on our constitutional democracy here at home. And I'm a liberal internationalist. I believe in international norms, standards, and institutions, but without the continuity and vitality and legitimacy of American constitutional democracy, I don't know how we maintain any kind of a normative international community that also helps shore up a prosperous, stable global economy that's in all of our interests. Maybe the Europeans can find it within them to take over the mantle of leadership. They haven't for decades. Maybe they can now. Frankly, I hope they do. I think they should. But we may be moving into a leaderless world, already in a leaderless world. But I just feel so strongly right now at this moment that we've got to start drawing some lines. Harvard University about 3 hours ago rejected the demands from the Trump administration, demands that Columbia and other great universities had kowtowed to. Some of the law firms that have come under attack have said no, they're not going to submit to shakedown terms that have come from the White House. I think that I don't want to be overly optimistic. I'm a realist as well as an optimist, but I'd like to think that there are some possible turning points here. And I think that corporate America has to understand that the most fundamental form of corporate responsibility right now is to support American constitutional democracy at home and leadership in some semblance of a rules-based international community. So we've come a long way here with this evolution of multinational corporations and geopolitics and conflict. And I think that we're at just an extraordinary turning point here just in the last 11 weeks. And I'll just end with a quote, which may be apocryphal, but I found it useful in the last couple of months. It's a quote ascribed to somebody I never thought I would quote in my whole life. I still don't do so approvingly, but it's a quote ascribed to Vladimir Lenin, of all people, who supposedly said during or shortly after the Russian Revolution that sometimes nothing happens in decades, but sometimes decades happen in weeks. I feel that decades have happened in the last 11 weeks. And stakes couldn't be higher for corporations, and most importantly, much more importantly, the corporate America, the United States of America, and the international community. So let me end with that.
Thank you. Thanks, Bennett. That was a tour de force, as I expected. So we'd like to just open it up for a bit of a conversation now with all of you all, based on all of that content. I might lead off with a question, and as others maybe think about what they might want to ask. One of the kind of confusing things for me in all of this is this contradiction between a kind of dismantling of a trade order at a moment when there's a lot of concern about national security, and this kind of peculiar dependence we have on China for rare earth minerals, which they actually they put tariffs on yesterday, or they're actually refusing to kind of shift to the United States. China dominates the kind of the sort of the whole area of rare earth minerals, which are critical to sort of chip production, which are critical to our ability to fly our most sophisticated sort of weapon systems and our aircraft and our aircraft carriers and all of our sort of weapon systems. And yet we're actually put ourselves in a situation where we actually can't, we can't access these vital minerals. And the other interesting thing is all of the production of lithium that's needed for the chip production is actually done in China because they've got all the processing technology. And in these quiet Chatham House rules events going on in Washington, there's all these quiet national security meetings going on in Washington right now about what are we going to do about our inability to get rare earth minerals, our inability to actually access a lot of the other kinds of minerals we need, where the Chinese have already come into Latin America and Africa and actually sewn up the supply chains for their own interest in the long run. And here we are declaring war on a trade war on China, at a time when it actually puts us at an incredible risk in terms of national defense.
I couldn't agree more with the point you just made. And critical minerals are truly critical to our economic security, to any hope of easing the climate crisis by developing renewables. Talk about a strategic good. It doesn't get any more strategic. And I have to say, while I hold no brief for the government of China, far from it, their response to the declaration of 125% tariffs is rational. It's a rational response. It sounds extreme, but they have leverage on us. It's not just our leverage on them. And it goes to a broader point here, just about how irreversibly interconnected the global economy has become. And You know, that's as we've talked about, and Ray's spent much of his last 25 or 30 years of his career working on. There's been inequalities that have been exacerbated by that interdependence that we need to further diminish, or start to diminish. But I got to say, as somebody who is no friend of the government of China, who has been active in the Uyghur movement, and I can't go to China. I was very much in the media in the run up to and during the Beijing Olympics, pointing out the Uyghur problem at a time when there was some visibility with China. I can't go there, but I got to say, and as happy as I was to see major companies stop sourcing from Xinjiang, I'm not in favor of decoupling US and Chinese economies. We have to draw some lines in certain areas like semiconductors. Thank God we've developing our own greater self-dependence on that. I thought that the Biden administration did exactly the right thing there. But I'm somebody who believes that, for what it's worth, that the US-China relationship is so critically important. It's the most important defining geopolitical relationship of the 21st century, and we need to maintain a trade and investment and overall financial and economic ballast to the relationship if we want to avoid not just a trade war, but a real war between the US and China, which would be a catastrophe for both countries in the world. So I actually, disagree sometimes with some of my China hawk friends who are also human rights people, whether it's with a Hong Kong focus or a Xinjiang focus. I think we need to manage our differences with China, not gloss them over. But you couldn't be more right, Ray, to emphasize what a pickle we're in now with critical minerals in response to this tariff. And there couldn't be a better argument for rethinking and frankly walking back the current approach than exactly this issue you've underlined.
Great. Open it up to anyone who might have a question.
Or comment.
Or comment.
Challenge.
Challenge, yes, whatever. Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Do you have the mic?
Thank you, Bennett. Excellent presentation. I don't think I have any criticisms of it, but I would add a couple things maybe for us to think about. I'm on the board of the United Nations Global Compact, and I have been on the board since it was founded 20 years ago. The assumption when I joined the board was that US companies going into Russia and China and other countries who are having trouble would in fact enhance human rights. This was the assumption.
Yep.
And so I encouraged many companies, as you may know, a lot of CEOs are Notre Dame graduates. I've got a lot of connections. I encourage companies to go into those countries because it was a way of advancing human rights. That was the assumption. I edited a book called Peace Through Commerce. I'm a little embarrassed by it today, but that was everyone's assumption. And it didn't work. I mean, for a while, China, in fact, was advancing human rights. And you know this better than I. Labor unions were not explicitly tolerated, but they were becoming in place. Then the Central Communist Party was afraid they were losing power. And so they put a real clamp on. You talk about human rights too much now, and you find you or your family's in jail. Right. We encourage companies to go into Russia in the UN Global Compact, and an awful lot did. Not just because UN encouraged it, but because they had good labor, and they could make good money there. But there was a lot of encouragement coming from people like me in the UN Global Compact. I remember Kofi Annan, the Secretary General then, when we founded, said, there's been massive amounts of wealth created with multinationalism, massive amounts, but it's not distributed particularly well. And I said, well, I do a lot of work in Africa. You're thinking African countries. Well, he said, have you been to Detroit lately? He said, there is an example. You're going to have a lot of pushback in this country unless you find a way to have a fair distribution of all the wealth. And of course, so many of our graduates at Notre Dame are in the wealthy category. Just take a look at our endowment, and you can see these people have done very well with multinational companies and going into developing countries. But a lot of the problems that you described at the end with Trump, I have total agreement with, but how did we get into that situation? I think a lot of it is because of the very unequal distribution of wealth and power in the United States, which was caused by some of our concerns and advocate of what was going on with multinational companies. I had a 4-hour board meeting of the UN Global Compact this morning, so it's all this is on my mind. But in any event, excellent presentation. You got me thinking about these issues. And you know a lot more than I do on the human rights part.
I don't, but thank you. I appreciate that. You know, the peace through commerce theme was exactly right. It's not axiomatic. It doesn't always work, but the United States has stood for that for decades. There's a quote I found when I was with Secretary of State Christopher that I think we used for the argumentation for the foreign policy argumentation for the Uruguay round, the last big global round of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that we concluded the deal in late 1993. The quote was from Cordell Hull. I don't think anybody's been quoting him for a long time, but he was Secretary of State under FDR during World War II, and his line was, "When goods move, armies don't." And that harkened back to the Smoot-Hawley ultra-protectionist tariffs imposed by the U.S. In the 1930s that helped set the stage, indirectly at least, for World War II. I remember writing a line for Secretary of State Christopher that I still like the line rhetorically, but I'm kind of ashamed of it substantively, but it tells you what we were thinking. We had linked at the beginning of the Clinton administration most favored nation trading status for China with overall significant progress on human rights. Well, we set the bar pretty low. We thought the Chinese could step over it. They didn't have to jump over it. Well, they weren't willing to play ball. They weren't willing to step over it. And we started getting open dissent within the Clinton cabinet with then Secretary of Commerce Ron Brown and Secretary of Treasury Lloyd Benson openly disparaging the policy. I was writing it for Secretary of State Christopher. We ended up delinking most favored nation status from human rights. And I had the nice assignment of writing the speech explaining why we were doing that, but why we still were optimistic about progress with China as it would open up its economy, and if not human rights, at least civil society would emerge. And the line I came up with, which was debated at the run-through of the speech the night before, I think on May 1st, 1994, the line I wrote was, ultimately, the software of freedom will prevail over the hardware of repression. I mean, that was very 90s, software, hardware. Nobody thinks or talks like that anymore. But that line crystallized our illusions, our aspirations and our illusions in much in the same way as business peace through commerce does. But, you know, it's the right thing for the United States to support. We have that line that I wrote 31 years ago.
Anybody else? Want to ask questions? Yeah.
Mr. Freeman, I want to thank you for coming out here and talking to all of us. My name is Jeannie Benedict. I'm a senior here, and I think I might represent a large majority of general knowledge and also lack of knowledge on a lot of different topics as a college senior who's not necessarily a political science nor a finance major, and who's trying to stay as educated on as many possible topics as possible from day to day as many new headlines are popping up. And And as a senior who is going into the job market and flying away from education for the most part, and my friends as well, whether they have jobs lined up or are still looking for them, trying to go into kind of that turbulent time. I was wondering if you think that there is any or could give any type of argument that provides hope for students who are going into, these big industries. And I mean, we've talked about a lot of, the negative impacts of tariffs and various, new administration policies. But I was wondering, and this may be, kind of on the devil's advocate side of arguments to make, but I was wondering if you had any
Yeah.
potential.
Oh, gosh.
You know,
I so appreciate
upsides.
your raising this question. And we're actually going to do an event tomorrow on exactly this question of how do you think about being in what I call the change the world business now in this circumstance. If you're a Notre Dame senior or graduate student, how do you think about this? And I gave a talk on exactly this subject at Berkeley 5 weeks ago. This was 30 days into the administration and people were despondent and upset. And I tried to paint some picture of hope, and I'll talk about it here tomorrow. But my quick answer is that the work that we all have to do in our lives, in our jobs, in our careers is too important to give up faith and hope and some optimism, if not confidence, that that work can go forward. We have to be realistic. USAID and much of the development community has been eviscerated. Lots of the NGOs funded, not just the AID jobs, but funding of NGOs from USAID, for the National Endowment for Democracy, the different components of that, other parts of the US government is gone for now. The USAID equivalent in the UK, DFID, is being cut in half, some of the other European aid agencies. For the development work and maybe some of the human rights and democracy work, this is a hard time. For some of the corporate work, sustainability, climate, we've been dealing with this backlash against ESG, which we've seen DEI, if not thrown overboard substantively, at least the language reform changed. But my view is that these agendas, the work is too important to give up, and that there will be politically some degree of resilience, and it may take a couple or a few years, but this administration and this guy in the Oval Office cannot kill the poverty and development agenda, cannot kill the inclusion and equity agenda, cannot kill the labor and human rights agenda, cannot kill the climate and environmental sustainability agenda. And if you're a student at Berkeley, where I was, and the students that I was there with 5 weeks ago, and again 12 days ago, meeting with a number of them on exactly this question of now what? Or if I'm a student at Notre Dame and I'm inspired by this great university and everything here and the whole tradition of Catholic social teaching that's so important for the whole world, we just can't give up. Now, it's easy for me to say that. I'm not 22 years old anymore and wondering about what I'm going to do for a job a year or two from now, or even less. So this is hard. I don't want to deny it's hard, but I just think that what's most important when you graduate from a Berkeley or a Notre Dame or wherever it is to know who you are, what you care about, what you believe in, what you want to commit to, how you want to spend your career and life, and not let this last 11 weeks ruin all that. And to have some hope that if you are committed, you will find luck and you'll make a difference. And we can talk about it more specifically beyond that. And I'm just trying to, project a little bit of optimism tempered by realism. And the realism is pretty severe right now, but we're going to get through this in some ways if individuals commit, if institutions stand up, whether it's the legal profession or universities like Harvard did a few hours ago. We'll see if others do, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate your concern in your question. And I'm sure that the Notre Dame community is going to be nurturing its students who are worrying and frankly losing sleep about this, because this is a real grave threat. But it's such a privilege to come to this university imbued with the spirit here of Notre Dame, and to try to go out in the world and make a positive difference. And I'm confident you're going to be able to. It's just going to be a little harder in some of these areas in the immediate short term. That's the best answer I can give in a couple of minutes. But I really appreciate your candid question.
Well, maybe just to pick up on the opportunity tomorrow at noon in the Keough School, and I think is it 10:50 or 10:50 or 10:30, Sue? Basically, one of the two rooms, it's off the atrium in the Keough School. Basically, we're doing a session. He's doing 3 sessions tomorrow. One of them is basically for students who are thinking about potential careers in kind of the human rights, social change area. And so that's basically just for students, and it's at lunchtime tomorrow. And I think is lunch provided? And you get a lunch too. So you get a lunch and you get a career talk. So that's basically programmed for tomorrow. And there's also an event set tomorrow afternoon at 4 at Mendoza, basically looking at this whole question of what he referred to as ESG backlash. In other words, what is the implication of the ESG backlash in terms of are companies really responding to that, or how are they handling that? And in some ways, it's kind of a partial answer to your question too. In other words, where is there resilience there? Are the companies going to push back a little bit or quiet down, but continue doing what they're doing? So that's a conversation we're having tomorrow afternoon over in Mendoza. And that's going to be more of a panel format. Anybody else with a question or comment?
I have a question if nobody else does. We spoke about other nations and their commitment to human rights. What would it take for the US to actually get sources of slavery out of our own supply chains? Like the cocoa industry, for instance. There's many. Yeah, like all the chocolate companies have known for a very long time that they're sourcing beans from children that are held in slavery, and they have given lip service to removing it, but nobody's actually, they keep pushing the goalpost further down. Nobody's actually taken the steps necessary to get those.
Great question.
Use your mic.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's a great question. So the cocoa issue is one that I've been aware of, but never really directly involved with. And it's one of the most intractable issues around involving child labor and some forms of what we call modern slavery. And, there have been all kinds of efforts. I mean, Oxfam has been involved with companies like Nestle, all that, and making some progress, but it's really difficult, and with the companies and policing their own supply chains, but dealing with some of the countries and local communities and some of the expectations that defy at least institutional and legal norms of child labor. So I don't have an answer on that. What I do have a partial answer for is related to 2 big campaigns I've been involved with, one sort of peripherally and the other pretty centrally, very centrally, is we have had some successes. We now have, at least for the US, we ban imports of goods from Western China, Xinjiang, that might be probably made with Uyghur forced labor. We've gotten that out of the apparel sector. We're still working on getting it out entirely from solar and automotive. VW has come under a lot of pressure for its factory there in Urumqi, I think. We're made a lot of progress, and the EU, picking up on what we did here in the US with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, has enacted recently a ban on imports of goods made with forced labor. But I'll tell you, once you get the Customs and Border Patrol element of the Department of Homeland Services, security rather, on your tail, that's about as welcome as a root canal or an IRS audit. They are fierce. So we've made progress there. The other area we've made progress that I've been hugely involved in since the inception is that we ended 75 years of massive forced labor in the cotton fields in Uzbekistan, in former Soviet Central Asia, forced labor that started in the 1930s, that persisted through the post-Soviet independence period. And I had the privilege of co-founding with a couple of other people the Cotton Campaign beginning in 2007. And we put together a multi-stakeholder coalition, and we had literally 330 global apparel brands, dozens of which were American, sign a pledge committing not to knowingly source cotton from Uzbekistan. And once their brutal, vicious dictator, Karimov, died in 2016, we saw an opening to engage the new government, and which we did. I led the engagement at the cabinet level of 2018 to 2022 in Tashkent. But we only had leverage because we had 330 apparel brands boycotting what was their major export of their whole economy, was raw cotton of pretty high quality. So that is a big win. I gave a talk 2 weeks ago at the University of Nottingham in England, talking about our strategy, our multi-stakeholder coalition, and whether it might be adaptable to other issues in the forced labor arena, including cocoa. I just don't have the specific answer on cocoa, but I love the question. And my point is that cocoa is still a big problem, not fully resolved. People like Ray and others have been quite involved in it. You might want to comment on it, but at least we have some positive stories of success in other countries on other forced labor issues from which we can learn and adapt.
Maybe on that one. So before I came here, I was up to my neck on that particular issue, and the focus was really the interesting thing about cocoa. There's 2 or 3 things that are quite interesting about it. One of them is it's threatened by climate change, and there's only 2 or 3 countries where it's actually produced. So the companies that are involved in chocolate production, they're really worried about the threat to the availability of the commodity. Can we imagine a world without chocolate? But that actually may be a victim of climate change. So that's one of the big worries they have. Then the other one, they've been sort of challenged on this question of, but not only child labor, but also the treatment of women. Because the way the whole production process works on the ground is it's harvested from trees, but actually there's very careful handling of the beans that actually women are charged with doing. And what had been going on was they'd pay the men, and the women would do all this really delicate, important processing, but they wouldn't get paid, or they'd get paid a fraction of what the men were getting paid. And then the child labor part of it was part of this. In some sense, it depended on where you were and how much the companies were able to monitor, whether the women were getting paid adequately, and then also whether there were children sort of, around the women that were also participating in the production process. But I think one of the interesting things about this, and maybe I'm going to bounce it back to you, Bennett, in a second, is what we were using was consumer pressure and changes in consumer tastes and consumer preference. And this is something that the companies are very, very tuned into. And we've done this on diamond purchasing in the past. And, blood diamonds was another campaign where, the idea was, don't buy diamonds from conflict affected countries. And that had some considerable impact. And of course, there was a movie made about it, in which, Oxfam was involved in actually the making of the film, in Global Witness as well, and Bennett was on the board of Global Witness. So anyway, there is this whole issue of consumer pressure, and I'd be interested to see what you might have to say about how real that is, and does it matter?
Not as real as doesn't matter as some of us wanted to think would be the case. It's a really important question, because when we think about theories of change, we want to mobilize different sectors and actors. We want to mobilize ourselves as citizens, as voters, as investors, and as consumers. And not all of those it's very hard to align all the above. The consumer piece, I think we've had high hopes. I've been involved in these discussions for at least 25 years. And there's been, I can't think of I don't know what the numbers are, but my sense is that the blood diamonds piece had more impact among a certain segment of consumers, particularly affluent, customers of, say, Tiffany, with the ultra high-end, expensive luxury jewelry. I think it broke through. I know it did to them.
Oh, no, yeah.
And Tiffany actually became a pretty progressive company. I've had some interactions with them over the years. I think that's more the rule than the exception than the rule. Gap and Nike and some of the others took some heat in the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s on so-called sweatshop labor. There were some boycotts. There was very active campaigns by students, probably including here at Notre Dame, United Students Against Sweatshops. We're talking 25 plus years ago at this point. But I have not seen major sustained consumer boycotts at scale. And maybe there's a future for that. Maybe we need to get smarter as to how that works digitally on people's smartphones and otherwise. But I think it's been more bark than bite and more hope than reality, with a few exceptions.
I'm going to contest that a little bit.
Please.
So just maybe on the Tiffany example, Mike Kowalski, the president of Tiffany's, I ended up having a whole relationship with him, and they basically got behind the legislation to produce the Kimberley process, which is basically to sort of identify the particular diamonds that were for sale from conflict-affected countries. But then what they did is they went ahead and created IRMA, this initiative for resource management, what is it, alliance or something like that, which basically produces, a whole set of guidelines for mining companies as to what are, in effect, the appropriate sort of practices the mining companies should be following. And the mining companies have been adopting that. So that's one where there was significant change. Okay, one. The other one, which I kind of lived personally, was I was living in Bangladesh for 5.5 years during the child labor campaigns here in the United States. And the students should know that actually Notre Dame was a leader in actually organizing campaigns here on campus on child labor. This was actually in the 90s. And Notre Dame was one of the sort of the leading sort of universities in the country, sort of the students taking sort of advantage of that opportunity. But in Bangladesh, the garment industry was being challenged because they had all kinds of child labor in the garment industry. And when I was living there, there were basically about 100 to 150 factories, largely with women workers, and they weren't giving them, they weren't giving them bathroom breaks. They were keeping them extra hours, weren't paying them overtime. There was all kinds of issues, and child labor was at the top of it. And the global child labor campaign got actually the Bangladesh garment manufacturers industry to actually eliminate child labor in all of the factories. Today, there are 4,000 to 5,000 factories, and there is no child labor. I mean, but that's a story you don't often hear. It's not an issue anymore. So anyway.
That's good. Yet I'm still struggling to think of current examples or recent examples of consumer pressure, at least coming from the US. So we have work to do, but these, just as like the examples I cited on forced labor on the Uyghur side and Uzbek cotton, these are positive examples that we need to adapt to other situations. So that is encouraging.
I mean, the one thing maybe on climate might be interesting. All of the polls on climate change is that the American public and the electorate actually understands that climate is a problem. I mean, I think the numbers are like 75% of the public would like to see our federal government do more about climate change, and our legislators don't do it. So there is this disconnect between public attitudes and actually the actions and decisions being made by our legislators. And that's where political pressure could, in some sense, make a difference.
Yeah.
And even I would note, interestingly, our Republican congressman from this district is actually pushing a kind of a renewable energy initiative, which at a time when that seems like a little bit out of favor with the White House. But he's playing to the electorate. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us today. I have a question with regards the Alien Tort Statute. I'm not sure if you are familiar with that, but it won't seem like a promising avenue for holding corporations accountable for human rights abuses, especially committed abroad. And I wonder, well, since current a case, the Cuba and Gessner case, it seems that avenue might not be possible, but I'm wondering if you have any insights into that or what you think about that. and any potential other legal avenues for holding corporations accountable for human rights violations committed abroad, but that might be brought here to be held accountable here in the U.S. Under U.S. jurisdiction.
That's a complicated question, and it's going to stretch my knowledge, but there were hopes and efforts in the 2000s to use the U.S. legal system, as you know, to hold private sector actors accountable for human rights violations in other countries. And there were some lawsuits filed in the late 1990s and through the 2000s under the Alien Torts Claims Act. And there was a big one against an oil company, Unocal, that subsequently became part of Chevron for human rights violations in Burma, now Myanmar. And there have been others filed against Shell in Nigeria. And I mention that one in particular because this became quite controversial. Shell contested, as it was their legal right and responsibility, to try to contest their liability in the case. And the case was decided a dozen years ago. I think it was in 2013. But our lawyers made the argument, as I recall, that effectively gutted, almost incapacitated, almost but not quite totally eliminated the use of that statute from the late 18th century to bring these cases to these cases to bear. And I do remember our friend John Ruggie, who passed away in 2021, who was UN Special Representative for Business and Human Rights, and Oliver and I and others have been close to him over the years. He, to his great credit, publicly criticized Shell for really exceeding their brief and constructing their defense in a way that resulted in basically the incapacitation of this statute, that they went further than they needed to win the case. And as a result, I don't think that there's been any significant further cases decided positively. And it had a kind of a chilling effect on legal efforts, if I'm remembering correctly, to hold companies accountable. That said, I do know from my recent and current work that some companies still do fear legal liability, even if it comes from other statutes. So one company in particular that I've tangled with for 25 years that's notorious for its aversion to any possible liability is Chevron, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. And I remember I used to try to reason with them to say that if you maybe worry a little less about legal liability and put a little more effort into implementing human rights policies and engaging with stakeholders and local communities and not demonizing NGOs or critics, if you actually work more on the positive side, then maybe some of the legal threats against you might dissipate over the years. And, it's a non-legal argument. It's a political argument. They didn't buy it, but those threats have not dissipated against them. But look, I mean, I appreciate the question. I wish I was more currently knowledgeable with my answer. But my own view is that responsibility is toothless, corporate responsibility without accountability. It's not just one or the other. I've personally have spent more time the last 25 years on the responsibility side of the equation of setting standards, across sectors, but without accountability mechanisms, legal accountability mechanisms, and the threat of litigation and judicial remedy, we don't have real responsibility. It sort of is analogous to how we used to operate U.S. foreign policy under administrations of both parties. We would do diplomatic engagement with the threat on occasions of using military force, but only as a credible threat. That's not how we went about it. Sometimes we got ahead of ourselves, and we did, say with Iraq. Maybe it's not a great analogy, but the point is that Responsibility and accountability, I think, are two sides of the same coin, and real responsibility doesn't work unless you have the threat of accountability. In an ideal world, responsibility should be sufficient, but we're in a fallen world and we have to rely on legal accountability. And that's why there's been such a thrust, such an emphasis for so many years now on regulating, say, human rights. And we have had some successes in that in some specific areas, like human rights due diligence in certain areas. So I appreciate the question, but the question really touches on not just my lack of current specific knowledge of where some of these cases are, but it really does go more fundamentally to the whole debate that I've been in the middle of for 25 years in the corporate responsibility arena, the business and human rights arena. What's the right balance between voluntary versus legally binding, the right balance between responsibility and accountability? And I've never been aligned with friends who might be to my left politically who say it's all about legally binding accountability. I don't buy that, but I sure as hell don't buy the proposition that it's all about voluntary responsibility. It's absolutely, in my experience, both.
So maybe just for the students again, that there's an event tomorrow in the atrium that would be sort of more career focused, and there's lunch. So, you know, if you are available and you're interested, feel free to come. Please join me in thanking Bennett for, I think, a lively presentation, the tour de force, I think, of the current sort of geopolitics in the world, and I think lively answers to most of our questions. So thank you very much.